Amen. That was an interesting conversation with the kids, wasn't it? Kind of awkward, but interesting. Interesting. Nobody wanted to be the king or queen from the perspective of how they're treated. They just wanted to talk about how they were going to treat other people. Interesting. So here we are at this Sunday that we call Christ the King. Every year I tell this same story of how we got to have this Sunday called Christ the King, or Reign of Christ, or I think it's actually officially Reign of Christ, King of the Universe. Has a very long-winded title. The Pope came up with it. Not the current one. Pius XI in 1925 thought it would be a really great idea if there was a Sunday that acknowledged Jesus as King who reigns over us and reigns in our lives. I think the Pope was concerned about rise in secularism and particularly nationalism at the time in 1925, and thought this would be a great way to encourage people to think of Christ reigning in our lives rather than the secular structures that we're trying to control our lives. And it, by the way, wasn't originally on this day. It got moved to this Sunday because this Sunday is the last Sunday of the church year, and it just seems kind of appropriate that we would have a Christ the King Sunday before we enter Advent and come to the arrival of the King. I have some issues. I'm going to tell you right now, I have some issues with the whole Reign of Christ King thing. I do have some issues, but many of those issues are related to the same issues that I have around some of the other language and other ways in which we describe Jesus. And in fact, a lot of language that we use in church, which tends to be very much not in keeping with the Pope's idea that we would understand Jesus reigning in our secular as well as our church lives, like those are two separate things, because they're not two separate things. And I think what the Pope was trying to do was reach out from the church to over the rest of things, rather than trying to simply connect. And maybe that's the source of my issue with this, is that the more we talk about Christ the King and Christ ruling in our lives to people who don't understand the context of the meaning of king in the Bible and those sort of it just gets really, it's about power and control. And I was thinking this week about the story that we have today from the crucifixion story, and the "This is the King of the Jews" sign. If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. And I was thinking about that, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, sidebar, the more I thought about this, I went in a particular direction with this. And it's the traditional direction of how do we understand king, the meaning of the king. And that Jesus is very much redefining what that means. That the people in Jesus' day did not expect a king that would be like Jesus. They were expecting the king who would lead an army to overthrow the Romans and restore the glory of Israel. Quite literally. And what they got was something completely different. And I very much going in that direction. And it was pointed out to me that it's much more nuanced than that. And this is absolutely right. This is the thing we do. We kind of generalize these stories sometimes and go, oh, it clearly means this, or because we want an answer and we want to be able to define it and things, when in fact, it's the nuanced part of it that is the thing that it could be most meaningful to us. I'll explain. First of all, by the first century, of course, Hebrew people didn't really call themselves Hebrew people anymore. They called themselves Jews because they lived in a place called Judea. They had land. They had a place. This is their place. And their understanding of what a king is was very much influenced, I think, not just by their understanding as we would say biblically, of what a king is meant to be. The idea of the shepherd and the one who cares and leads, but also very much influenced by the idea of the king who has power, and power in particular to defeat enemies. Power to defeat, say, I don't know, Roman occupiers of your country. And it's very easy for us to say, in Jesus' day, the king that they were expecting was a king who would be the warrior who would overthrow the Romans and restore the glory of Israel. But did they all expect that? Is it not fair to think that there might have been people in that day who thought the point of being king was that image more like the shepherd, of one who cares for the people, one who leads the people, one whose primary interest is the well-being of their people? Sure there were. There must have been. We don't hear about them necessarily in some of the stories. For instance, the Magi who arrive, they arrive with gifts that are fit for what kind of king? Well, a king who would live in a palace. I imagine they were quite surprised when that's not what they found. And yet, they still knew it was the king. We'll get to that in about 6 weeks. But there may very well have been, at the time, people who were not expecting the kind of king that we seem to think they were expecting. There may have been those who expected a king, someone who would lead with love and grace and compassion, very much the Jesus that they got. And in fact, that may be why so many people were willing to embrace Jesus initially, not just because he was different and he was redefining stuff, but because he was showing them something that they were connecting with, because they knew that's what it was supposed to be like. Perhaps they knew they were experiencing the kingdom. That's why they were wanting to learn from Jesus. That's why they were wanting to be with Jesus. They wanted to embrace Jesus, and not just because he was fuzzy like a sheep. If we start to think about that, a little bit less like it was very definitely this, and a little bit more like, do you see how there might have been more than one perception of Jesus, more than one understanding of Jesus? And then we see that there very definitely were those who expected to be Jesus to be the kind of king who was somebody who threatened authority, somebody who might well have been a threat to, say, the Romans, or someone who might have been a threat to those who were in power. Again, it's still really easy to look back and go, well, okay, yeah, we see this happening. We see that happening then. That's very good to know. Excellent. Good story. But it's happening now, isn't it? I'm always wary of using an expression like this, but I'm going to use it anyway just because I think it's worth considering this. There appears to certainly be those who would like to weaponize Jesus. There are. I mean, look at the nationalist evangelicals in the U.S., for example. Ardent right-wing conservatives for whom the idea of Jesus is the Jesus of power, the Jesus who will fight our enemies, the Jesus who will lead us in defeating our enemies. Our enemies, of course, being who we decide are our enemies. And there are very definitely followers of Jesus who are about love and care and compassion, about embracing everyone, about understanding differences rather than in a way that is embracing diversity rather than animosity and creating confrontation and having enemies. My way is the way. We're experiencing a similar thing even today. And you don't need to label it with king. We can say leader. You can say leader. You can say, I don't know, president. You can say whatever terminology is more familiar to us today, but we are experiencing a similar thing. There are those who see the role of the leader as the exercise of power over people, whose role is to lead us in defeating our enemies. And there are those who might see the role of the leader as the one who is caring and compassionate and cares for people and wants to understand others and work with others, collaborate with others in a way that creates a better world. So here we are with this image, Christ the King. Here we are with a prayer that we end with offering, "Thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory." How do we understand that? How are we understanding that? Are we understanding it as power over people? Are we understanding that as glory being the glory that comes with defeating our enemies and casting them into the fiery pit? Or are we willing to embrace a Jesus who is willing to give everything in order for there to be compassion and grace? A Jesus who is willing to give everything in order that the poor might be cared for, in order that people might have donuts. I think that was Elisa's first thing. In order that people might be fed, not just spiritually, but wholly. In order that we might have a world which becomes the creation it was initially in the stories we tell meant to be. We begin with a story of everything is good. Everything is good until choices are made that lead in a different direction. Perhaps that's where the Pope was going with this. Not so much about, not at all, in fact, about power or control over things, but in how Jesus might influence the choices we make. The Jesus of love and grace and compassion, the Jesus of empathy, the Jesus of love might influence the decisions and the choices that we make, not control them, not demand a specific choice or a specific interest, but encourage us somehow for us to live in a way that brings love and grace and compassion to all our choices, to all our decisions, to all our relationships, to how we treat each other, to how we treat the world. Imagine what a different kind of kingdom that would be. Tricky thing is, of course, just like the idea that some people envision Jesus as the Jesus of power, the Jesus of defeating our enemies, the Jesus of power over people, and there are people who envision Jesus as the Jesus of compassion and grace and empathy. We make choices. And there's this constant, I'm trying to avoid using the word conflict, but I guess that's where we're at, isn't it? Between those two things. And all of that ground in the middle, where it's a little bit of both. See, I was saying about this too, because one of the things that often is said is that the people were expecting a king like the great king the great David, right? A righteous branch, like David, who was perfectly flawless and compassionate and caring, right? No. David was not flawless and perfect. David may well have been a good king. But that doesn't mean that David also wasn't a king of armies and power and might. It also doesn't mean he didn't make bad choices. Oh, he made bad choices. Perhaps we need a little bit of understanding of both of those things in order that we might understand each other better. It seems like a lot of work and a long journey. It is. But imagine how different the world would be if instead of our journey being one of, this is how it's going to go, I don't want to know, or you're wrong, how about if it were, how can I better understand you? How can I find empathy even for those who would call me their enemy? How do I understand better? I think if we're going to embrace Jesus, we have to be prepared to embrace Jesus with the images that others will understand Jesus too. Jesus isn't just a shepherd. Jesus isn't just a king. Jesus is the bread of life. Jesus is the light of the world. We have all of these metaphors. None of them are perfect. None of them are perfectly a way to completely encapsulate Jesus. Oh, wait. Is there one? Jesus is love, just as God is love. And love includes grace and compassion, but it also includes empathy and understanding. Love includes a willingness to act, but it also includes a willingness to be patient and listen. That's how we'll find a way, perhaps. Perhaps. A way to understanding each other better, a way to finding a way to this kingdom of love and grace and compassion, the kingdom that is so near. Not just because it's in the stories of Jesus and in the way of Jesus, but because it's in us too. And when we can be in touch with that and embrace that, we can live that just like Jesus.